Good morning. As you know, we are working our way through the letter to the Hebrews, which has been explaining who Jesus is and what he has done, how he is better, how the new covenant that he inaugurated is better, and how his ultimate sacrifice is the only way for us to be accepted by God. And we're probably now in the most famous part of Hebrews, chapter 11, which is all about faith. Now that we know who Jesus is and what he has done, we are being told what we are to do with all of this information, how it is supposed to affect us, what our part is, which is we are to believe it, to have faith. Or more specifically, what we are being told is to live by faith. And that tells us that faith is something more than just something we think. Faith is not merely an intellectual thing, rather faith is something that we live. When I was growing up, my dad used to consistently threaten us as kids, probably because of his own experience, I think, that if he ever caught us smoking or even heard of us touching cigarettes, then we were going to be in the biggest trouble of our life. Because everybody knows, don't they, that smoking is not good for your health, is it? So why do some people do it? If everybody believes that it's bad for you, why do people do it? And we might think addiction. But people make that choice to smoke before they're addicted. And even after people are addicted, many people quit. The answer, I think, is that there are different types of belief. And there's this passive type of belief where we know something is true and we'll even acknowledge that it's true, and yet our heart is drawn to other things in spite of this. So even though everyone believes that smoking is bad for you, for some, their heart is still drawn to what it offers. You know, some kind of physiological response or social acceptance or whatever it is. And then there's another type of belief, an active belief. And that's where we know something to be true and it's recognized as important enough to do something about it, so that we act on it. And so for some, even those who've been addicted to smoking, they act on this belief and they stop, because they recognize the importance of their own health more than the things that smoking offers. And the Bible tells us there is this same type of passive belief in God. For example, James in chapter 2 tells us that even the demons believe that God exists, but they still choose to oppose him. Or Jesus' parable of the soils, that seed that falls on thorny ground is passive belief. It's a knowledge of the truth, it's an acknowledgement even of the truth, but eventually they turn away because their heart is more drawn to riches and wealth and to the worries of this world, which they see as more important. And perhaps even more relevant to the context of the letter of Hebrews is the seed in that parable that falls on the rocky ground, which again is passive belief. It's the knowledge of the truth, even acknowledgement of that truth. But when persecution comes, they turn away because they value comfort and ease as being more important than the truth. And so Hebrews has been showing us what is most important, of eternal importance, is that there is no way to be accepted by God other than by this ultimate, once for all time sacrifice of Jesus. And through this sacrifice alone, we receive true life with God forever. Or we can face judgment and a horrible condemnation instead. And so because this is of the utmost importance, what is required is an act of faith that recognizes how important this is and acts upon it. It recognizes not only is this important, but what God has done for us through Jesus is the most important thing of all, ever. And therefore this should completely change and shape the way that we live. And so Hebrews tells us to imitate those who through faith inherit the promise. And in chapter 11, we've been given a definition of what faith is, and then we're given a whole lot of examples of what it is exactly we are to imitate. And so hopefully you remember from last week the definition of faith, that faith is the absolute assurance of what God has promised to do in the future, things hoped for. And it is the firm conviction of what God has done in the past, things not seen. Though we have not seen all of these things with our own eyes, faith is the certainty that God has done and will do everything that the Bible says. And so last week we looked at the examples of Abel and Enoch. And this week we're looking at Noah and Abraham and Sarah. And we're told firstly that by faith, Noah, when he was warned about things not yet seen, future things, obeyed in reverence and built a massive boat that saved his family. Even though what God described was something that Noah had never seen before, never experienced, probably couldn't fully comprehend it, even though a global flood seemed very unlikely, Noah believed. Not passively, but actively. He took action and he obeyed, and he spent literally decades building this massive ark, 1.5 rugby fields long, multiple stories high, in the middle of nowhere, miles from the sea. How silly that must have looked. And the Bible doesn't tell us, but people have long assumed that Noah would have been the brunt of many jokes and would have faced much ridicule and mocking for spending so many years of his life building this massive tanker in the middle of dry land. Not hard to imagine. In which case, faith is obeying God even when we face scorn. Even when we face ridicule and people poke fun at us, humiliate, persecute us. You know, I think that's exactly where some people think it's appropriate to stop obeying God. As soon as there's opposition or someone starts ridiculing us. But that is not faith. That is believing that the affirmation of people is more important than the affirmation of God. And so to have faith like Noah, which is what we're being called to do here, is firstly to obey God in the face of opposition. Then secondly, faith like Noah is obeying even when we might not understand. Even when it kind of seems illogical. Even when it's something we've never seen or experienced before, perhaps can't even comprehend. That's another area where I think people draw the line and think it's okay to stop obeying God when they can't understand why God says to do something. And you know, that might be wise in some areas of our life in order to prevent being deceived, but that is not appropriate with God. Because He is always completely faithful and trustworthy. He knows better than us. He always gets it right. And we should trust Him more than we trust even ourselves. Even when we don't always understand. Which is what Noah did. By faith he obeyed, and this right decision condemned the rest of the world who should have done the same. But they chose not to trust God and to act because a global flood seems so unlikely. And thus, by faith, Noah became an heir of righteousness. He became right with God. He didn't earn it. Being an heir doesn't earn the inheritance. So his obedience didn't earn it. Instead, he was given it by faith because he trusted God. Well, then Hebrews moves on to the example of Abraham, the ultimate Old Testament example of faith. And so particularly for Jewish readers, we are given 3 specific examples of faith from his life. And the first one is when God told Abraham to leave his extended family, his land, his home, and to go to a foreign land where God would make him into a great nation that would ultimately bless the world. And by faith, without any details, not even knowing where he was going, except that God would show him the way, Abraham obeyed. He packed up and left. He left behind his material inheritance, his land, his comfortable home, to go and live in tents instead as a stranger in a foreign country. And that's another area where I think some people draw the line to obeying God, when it might result in us being less comfortable. Yet Abraham did not resist. He didn't delay or complain or even question. He obeyed. And God was good to his promise. He indeed did make Abraham into a great nation. And what's really interesting is that none of that was through the hard work of Abraham. It wasn't because Abraham strived so hard, worked so hard, or even had this great willpower. None of that. It was simply because Abraham trusted and obeyed. Faith, in other words. It was only after Abraham arrived in Canaan that God then promised him the land as his possession. But critically, Abraham never got to see that day. It did happen because God is always good to his promise, And Abraham believed and trusted and obeyed, but he never got to see that happen in his lifetime. This nation. Nor did he get to see this country that he was to possess. In fact, we're told that that didn't matter to him, because his real desire anyway was instead that he was looking forward to a better home, a better city, a better land, the eternal city of God in heaven. And this is ultimately what Abraham trusted, and it's why he obeyed. Because he understood that the real reward is not an earthly one, but it's an eternal one. The real reward is God Himself and being in His presence forever, where everything is exactly and perfectly as God intends it to be. And so to have faith like Abraham, which is what we've been called to do, is to obey, knowing that such obedience is rewarded. That's verse 6 from last week. It is rewarded, but that ultimate reward is not here and now. That ultimate reward is later with God in His presence. And if we jump forward to verse 13, this was not just the case for Abraham, but his whole family, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, and others. They were all still living by faith when they died, and they were yet to still receive this promise, this land. They were still living as foreigners and strangers, seeing it from a distance, knowing that it would be true, but never during their own lifetime receiving it. And yet they considered it better to live in tents as foreigners and to obey God than to go back to the comfort of the country in which they left. They could have gone back, but they chose not to, because they too were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. And so far in Hebrews, we're not only told of a better mediator, a better prophet, a better high priest, a better covenant, a better sacrifice, a better hope, a better promise, a better possession. But here we're also told of a better country, a better home, an eternal one. And this speaks to the original Jewish recipients of this letter who are facing persecution. They're thinking to go back to old ways, and the argument here is the patriarchs didn't turn back. Even though it was harder and they were living in tents and they didn't immediately receive God's blessings, they continued to trust and obey, and to look forward to the eternal reward, which will make any hardships now all just totally worth it. In verse 6, we were told that faith pleases God, and He rewards it. And this is why God is not ashamed to be their God. God is pleased with them, in other words, and has prepared a city for them where faith will be rewarded. The second example from Abraham and Sarah as well is that God promised Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the heaven and the sand on the seashore. The only problem was that Abraham and Sarah didn't have any children. And both he and Sarah were past being able to do that, to have children. In Genesis, we're told that when God made this promise, Sarah laughed at it, expressing some doubt. And God's response to that was to say, "Why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for me?" And with this logic, it seems that Sarah overcame any doubts that she had. Because Hebrews tells us that by faith she became pregnant. In other words, God was the one who did this miracle, but he did it because Sarah believed. She trusted that God would be faithful to his promise. And so, like Noah, this is a faith in God even when it defies logic. This is trusting that when God says that he'll do something, he will do it, no matter how extraordinary it is. Because the one who made the universe by simply speaking can do anything. And so not only did Sarah give birth to Isaac, but God also fulfilled the bigger promise. That eventually from this man who was as good as dead, meaning beyond having the ability to have children, from this man came numerous descendants and a great nation. But again, as with the promised land, Abraham and Sarah never received this promise in full. They did receive a son, but they never got to see all these descendants, this great nation. And yet they still trusted and obeyed with absolute assurance that God would do it. Before we look at the third example from Abraham, maybe it's also good to remember that Abraham did have a few faith failures as well. He certainly wasn't perfect. He made some mistakes. One of those was when he went down to Egypt because of a famine. And instead of trusting God to protect him, which God needed to do in order to fulfill his promise to make him into a great nation, instead of trusting God to protect him, Abraham, because he was scared that Pharaoh might kill him in order to take his wife, he lied to Pharaoh and told him that Sarah was really his sister, which certainly created some problems. And then later on in life, as he and Sarah were getting old and they still had no child, in order to fulfill this promise, instead of trusting God, they decided to take matters into their own hands. They decided to try and do this themselves by Abraham sleeping with Sarah's servant Hagar. And this caused all kinds of problems. And so this actually encourages me. I'm not sure about you, but I've certainly had some faith failures of my own. And so it's encouraging to see that this great man of faith wasn't always perfect. It's encouraging to see that God never gave up on Abraham despite the fact that he had some failures. But it does seem that what happened is that as time went on, Abraham grew in his understanding of who God was, grew in his understanding of how trustworthy and reliable God is. And as a result of that, Abraham's own trust and obedience matured as well. Until Abraham was able to face the ultimate test and pass. And that is the third example from his life. It's not hard to imagine that since Abraham and Sarah waited so long for a child, that their only son must have been a great source of pride and joy to them. Isaac was truly a gift from God, and surely they must have loved him deeply. And the danger for all parents, but especially for Abraham and Sarah, is that they might love and become more devoted to their son than they are to God. In biblical terms, this is called idolatry. It's giving to someone or something what we should only give to God. And it seems this is what God seeks to test in Abraham. Is he more committed and devoted to his son or to God? And so God tells Abraham to go to Mount Moriah and to do the unthinkable, to sacrifice his son Isaac there. We know from Genesis and from hindsight that God never intended for Abraham to go through with this. But the dilemma for Abraham, other than the repugnant thought of sacrificing your own child, the dilemma is also that it just makes no sense. In fact, not only does it not make any sense, but it seems to precisely contradict what God has already promised. To make a great nation, which was to happen through Isaac. How can God do this if Isaac dies? And so God asks Abraham to obey him here, even though it makes no sense at all. And this is where many people would draw the line, I think. Stop obeying God when it makes no sense. A contradiction we tend to assume is justification for us to not obey. And I think that there would have been a time when Abraham would have done exactly that. But by this stage in his life, he is an old man. And he has many years of experience with God's faithfulness and trustworthiness. By this stage, his faith is rock solid. God has always provided. He's always been reliable. And so we're told in Genesis that without any protest, without any resistance, without even questioning, and without any delay, Abraham woke up early the next morning and set out in obedience. And when he reached the mountain, he built an altar, and he tied Isaac up, and he raised the knife above his head. At this point in his life, Abraham trusts God so much that he doesn't doubt that the promise that God's made him. He doesn't think God must have changed his mind. No, he knows that God's not like that. Instead, still trusting the promise that God has made, he reasons that since the promise will be through Isaac, that God must be able to raise the dead, and will do so with Isaac. And so in obedience, he raises the knife when, as we know, God intervenes. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead, because in this way, Isaac escaped death. Probably the hardest test anyone would ever face. And Abraham trusted God and obeyed. And he proved not only that he had rock solid trust, but he proved that his commitment and devotion were foremost to God above everything else, even his one and only son, his promised son, born in his old age. And this is why Abraham is the supreme Old Testament example of faith. Well, what is it that we are being shown about faith through Noah and Abraham and Sarah and being asked to imitate here? That faith is not merely something intellectual, something that we think, something passive. Rather, faith in God is so important that it is something that we act on. It's active. It's something that will change the way that we live. And from our examples today, we see that faith is obeying God even in the face of opposition and ridicule and persecution. Faith is obeying God even when it makes life hard and less comfortable. Faith is obeying God even when it seems to defy logic and reason. In reality, it doesn't, because God can do anything. Faith has been more devoted and committed to God than everything else, even family. Faith is trusting God more than I trust myself. Faith is making decisions knowing that this is not our real home. Faith is knowing that God rewards faith ultimately by bringing us home to be with Him, to be in His presence forever, where everything will be perfectly and exactly how He intends it to be. Let's pray. Father, you tell us in your word that you desire us to be people who live by faith. Like all these examples that we've been looking at today, like these examples that we are to imitate. You tell us this pleases you, and we want our lives to please you. And so while we recognize that there is much that we can do to deepen our trust in you, to be regularly in your word, seeing more of who you are and how faithful you are, that as much that we can do, we also ask for your help. That your Spirit in us would be at work to empower greater faith in us. We know you reward faith. And ultimately this means being with you forever in perfection. And we look forward to this with great anticipation. We thank you for this and for all your promises, which we know we can completely trust. Amen. Well, I don't think that we should read the events of Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac without stopping to consider how difficult this must have been to be in Abraham's shoes. Can you imagine that? How repugnant is that thought of sacrificing your own child? I'm not sure I would have passed that test. That might be where I would say no. That might be where many of you would say no. But that is not where God said no. For God loved the world, you and me, so much that he gave his one and only Son. What we are probably not prepared to do for God is exactly what God was prepared to do for us. What Abraham went to do that day on the mountain was really pointing ahead to something much greater, to the ultimate Father making the ultimate sacrifice of his only Son. The difference being there would be no intervention, no angel to stop it, no preventing the Son of God from being sacrificed. He would actually die. But thankfully, he would also actually rise from the dead, just like Abraham knew God could do. And Isaac escaped that day because a substitute was provided, a ram caught in the thicket. And Abraham lived because another died in his place. Isaac's blood was spared because another's was shed. And this is true for us as well. Jesus died in our place, and his blood was shed so that ours need not. And I think that God gave Abraham this experience, at least in part, so that Abraham could appreciate, experience, understand somewhat how God himself felt at the great cost that he paid to redeem us. So let's just take a moment now before we take communion to quietly contemplate this and to offer our own thanks and praise to God.